a chant for the death of Jewish soldiers, and by extension of the Jewish nation, was broadcast by the public broadcaster into millions of homes. That's an incredibly serious matter. It's one of the most serious things that the BBC has done ever. I don't even know what legitimate criticism of Israel would sound like now. I really don't know what it would sound like, because you never hear it. You never hear moderate, normal criticism of Israel. You never hear the kind of moderate criticism you hear about Turkey or Italy or even America, which gets a lot of flack. You don't hear that about Israel. So I have no idea what criticism of Israel would sound like, because all I see is blind bigotry and hysteria about Israel all the time.
Okay, welcome to an episode with one of my favourite guests, and I know one of your favourite guests as well on JTV. We're joined by the journalist and author, Brendan O'Neill. We're here to talk about all things that have been going on, and as I was saying to you, Brendan, just offline, it's a different world since we last spoke. And you were saying to me that I kind of expect to start writing about other things, going back to other issues, and you said I keep thinking this issue is going to die down, of Israel and its conflicts. And then you said, but it just keeps kind of festering away. And I was looking actually at some of your articles on Spike, and so many of them, not because of your choice, but because you're reacting to what's happening. So much of them are to do with anti-Semitism, Israel's actions, the obsession on Israel's war with Hamas. And you said and acknowledged that it doesn't make sense through the natural course of events and proportionately to other conflicts, other issues in the world. And so you said it's obviously something else is causing this focus and attention. Do you want to just unpack that a bit and explain why that is the case?
Yeah, I think we've known since the very beginning, since 7th of October itself and the fallout from it, that the Western left and the Western establishment's obsession with Israel was just disproportionate to what Israel was doing, which was legitimately fighting back against terrorists who carried out the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, disproportionate to the size of Israel, its global power, all those other issues that one might, legitimately have concerns about. The obsession with Israel is disproportionate to all of that. And the ferocity of the hatred for Israel, the lingering nature of it, the fact that it just isn't going away. It just blows up in different ways at different times. 1 minute it takes the form of from the river to the sea. The next minute it's death to the IDF. The next minute it's, people cosplaying as Palestinian militants by wearing their stupid little keffiyehs. It just is there all the time. It's either the constant background noise or it's the foreground noise when something really explodes. So something else is going on. In my view, it's anti-Semitism. In my view, this is the means through which Jew hatred now expresses itself. This is the vehicle it has latched onto to try and appear a little bit more legitimate than it appeared in the past. Going onto the streets now and saying death to the Jews is a bit controversial. You might even get arrested. But going onto the streets and saying death to the IDF is entirely respectable, apparently. My view, and I will die on this hill, is that a lot of people are saying death to the IDF because they know they can't get away with saying death to the Jews. And that's really what's going on right now.
And I want to know what you made of the whole controversy around Bob Vylan, or Pascal, I think it's Robinson is his actual name, this musician, quote unquote. I'm not quite sure how you could necessarily describe some of that as music or art, but rather hate, where he basically called for death to the IDF. Now, some people are attempting to make a argument that he's not calling for the death of all Jews or Israelis, but he's saying that he is against a particular army, and one could say death to the Russian army, and that therefore isn't necessarily the kind of incitement or genocidal language that one would say qualifies when you're talking about all Israelis or all Jews. What would you respond to with that argument?
Yeah, that's just bullshit, isn't it, really? I think we can all see through that pretty easily. I mean, for a number of reasons. Firstly, because, I've done a few media discussions about Bob Vylan and that chant. And a lot of people said to me, but what if someone had said death to the Russian army, or death to the People's Liberation Army in China, or even death to the British army? The point is, number one, they haven't said any of those things. They haven't said death to any other military force. So that's striking in and of itself. Just the army that is the one that defends the Jewish nation. And, the thing is, when people say it's just calling for the dismantling of a military machine, we know that's nonsense. We know that's nonsense for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because there's that subsequent clip from May, I think, before Glastonbury, at which Bob Villan was shown saying death to every single IDF soldier. There's no denying what that means. That means he wants individual soldiers to die. And he wants them to die, presumably, for the crime of being in the Israeli army, for the crime of defending the Jewish homeland from the terrorists that surround it. So there's no mystification there. And I wrote a piece for The Spectator saying, if you add together those two chants made by Bob Villan, the one in May and the one at Glastonbury, that's worse than what Lucy Connolly said. Now, your listeners may be familiar with Lucy Connolly. She's the British woman who's serving 31 months in jail for a really horrible post that she put up during the Southport riots, where she said, burn down the hotels with all the immigrants inside, I don't care, something like that. Gross stuff. No one is going to defend such a horrible tweet. But what Bob Villan said, if anything, was worse, because he said death to every single IDF soldier, which is, as you will know, hundreds of thousands of people if you include the reserves along with the active personnel. It also includes many young British men and women, young British Jews who have gone to fight for the IDF, some of whom are still in the ranks of the IDF. So it's an open cry to kill people in Britain, people in Israel, and people around the world, in fact, who may have served in the IDF. So it's worse than what Lucy Connolly said, and yet he's roaming free, playing his crap music, and she's rotting in a jail cell. So there's something not right here. The truth of the matter is, the reason death to the IDF is a hateful call and even a genocidal cry, I would say, is firstly because the IDF, as everyone knows, is predominantly a Jewish army, not entirely, but most of the soldiers in the IDF are Jews. And secondly, because the IDF is the only force standing between the Jewish homeland and its complete obliteration by the armies of anti-Semites that surround
Yeah.
it. So if
Yeah.
you say death to the IDF, you are saying death to the Jewish homeland, which means death to the Jews of the Middle East. Now, you either don't know that, which makes you ignorant, or you do know that, which makes you a racist. So that's what the people at Glastonbury have got to choose between. Are they ignorant or are they racist?
Yeah, yeah, and there's the whole campaign to delegitimize anything that the Jewish People's Army is doing, calling it genocide, calling it ethnic cleansing, or whatever the term is. They're basically doing all they can to undermine the Jewish people's right to defend themselves and thus live. So, it's all about whether you consider or frame the actions of what the IDF do as just, fair, and normal as any country would, or whether it's some kind of evil. And that's clearly what they're trying to do. They're trying to put it into the same camp as someone like the Nazi army or something like that.
Yes, that they've been playing that trick since 7th of October itself. I mean, the day itself, when it was Hamas that was carrying out a genocidal onslaught against the Jewish people and indiscriminately raping and slaughtering Jewish women and men and children. It's Hamas that was doing that. And on the day that Hamas was doing that, we know that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign was applying for the right to march against Israel. We know that a few hours after it, a day and a half after that attack, people were celebrating outside the Israeli embassy in London and outside the Sydney Opera House in Sydney and on the streets of Berlin. So, yeah, from the very beginning, people have just been engaged in the most extraordinary case of moral inversion that we've seen in our lifetime. So it was Israel that was attacked by a genocidal army, but it's Israel that's accused of genocide. It was Israel that was subjected to the most ferocious act of racist violence, and yet it's Israel that is accused of racism. Just the world turned completely on its head. Truth turned into lies everywhere we look. But you're right, they treat the IDF, or they demean the IDF as an uniquely bloodthirsty force, as an army that loves to kill children, as an army that intentionally shoots children. All those echoes of the blood libels come rushing back. This notion that the Jewish army, unique among the armies of the world, has this bloodlust for dead kids. I mean, you don't have to be a scholar in medieval history to hear the echoes of the past in those kinds of libels
Mm.
and those kinds of accusations. The thing that strikes me most about the cry "Death to the IDF," this has really horrified me actually, is the speed with which it has spread around the world. So it is made popular at Glastonbury. The next thing we know, it's been chanted outside the Welsh Parliament. Then it was chanted in Westminster. Then it was scrawled on a telephone box in Swiss Cottage in order to taunt the many Jews who live in that part of London. Then it was chanted on the streets of New York. And then it was chanted by a feral mob in Melbourne, in Australia, as they attacked a Jewish restaurant last at the weekend. They
Mm.
firebombed a synagogue when there were Jews inside. Luckily, a 13-year-old Jewish kid wouldn't let this person in, and therefore he saved lives. So they threw a firebomb at the door of this synagogue, and then they went to a Jewish restaurant and harassed and attacked the customers, all while shouting "Death to the IDF." So this is what we're talking about. This is how anti-Semitism and Jew hatred now spreads around the world. In the olden days, it would be spread through the rumor mill between backward townsfolk who would say, "Did you hear what the Jews did? They killed that child. They took his blood, etc., etc." It was the kind of local rumor mill that would spread these hateful, apocalyptic lies about the Jews. Now they spread through the fibers and the wires of the digital global village at the speed of light. And so one minute there, a bunch of posh kids are chanting "Death to the IDF" at Glastonbury, and they think it's really funny. The next minute, it's been shouted by a mob who are screaming in the faces of Jews. You
Yeah.
just you do find yourself
Oh, by the way,
wondering
there would
what.
be Jews there in Glastonbury in the audience, and I had a friend of mine last year. Actually, he had the bravery and courage to wave an Israeli flag. There's plenty of national flags that are waved there. But I know he actually faced some people kind of saying shalom and hi, but a lot of very searing looks at him.
Yeah, this is, it's the new form that anti-Semitism is taking. And, whenever I see these plummy activists on TV, and they're always quite posh, the ones, I won't name any of the organizations just in case, but, they're always quite posh. They've always got their keffiyeh on. They've always got all the time in the world, it seems, to be sitting
Yeah.
around protesting all day long. I just can't help thinking to myself, this is the latent anti-Semitism of the English upper classes come back to
Mm.
life. And
Yeah.
they've just found a new means through which to express it. These are the kind of people who come from a certain section of English society where there has historically been a problem of anti-Semitism. And they're just expressing it in a way that they think is more palatable and more political than their grandfather might have done, or their great grandmother, or Unity Mitford, or whoever it might be. At least in the past, posh English people were a bit more honest about their anti-Semitism. What we have now is a new layer of the activist class, which is dishonest and which says that it's only opposing a war and an army, but in truth, it is ferociously hating on the world's only Jewish state and obsessing over it to the neglect of every other issue in the world.
Well, this was actually going to be my next question. There was a whole debate that raged online afterwards about the Bob Villain incident at Glastonbury. Does this represent, Bob? Sorry, not Bob. Pascal and the audience that were chanting and singing along with him. Do they represent how even not even most Britain, but a lot of Britain thinks, or are they just kind of a small minority? How representative was this?
That's a good question. I think about that quite a lot. My instinct is that there is a lot of hatred for Israel out there, and we have to be honest about that. And it's very pronounced in influential circles.
Mm,
So that makes it worse in some ways because these are the
yeah,
people who are opinion formers and who write novels and who go to Glastonbury and who work at newspapers and who work at the BBC, of course. There is a ferocious level of hatred for Israel amongst those influential sections of society. I mean, look at the BBC. Just look at what they've been pumping into people's homes every single night for 20 months. They've been giving us the message, essentially, that there's only one war in the world and that it's the worst war that has ever taken place. That is
yeah.
essentially what their reporting has boiled down to over the past 20 months. It's a lie, and it's, I think, fomenting hatred for the Jewish nation and by extension for Jewish people. when I meet someone who says to me, I think it's a bit more complicated, I'm not sure Israel really is the bad guy, I just want to hug that person. Because if you can withstand that level of moral and media pressure to hate Israel, and there is an extraordinary amount of moral and media pressure for people to hate Israel, if you can withstand that and think a bit more independently, then I think you're a special person. Yes, there is. I would say that in certain circles, in certain classes, and in certain industries, the hatred for Israel is intense and hysterical, and I think quite dangerous. I do think there's probably a layer of ordinary people out there who are a bit more commonsensical and who either don't think about this conflict that much, or if they do, they probably think, well, it's a war and war is ugly, or they might think they're both as bad as each other. I think they probably have a bit, they don't quite have the view I would like them to have, which is that Israel is fighting a heroic war on behalf not only of the Jewish nation, but also the world. But they have a more nuanced take than some of these lunatics at Glastonbury. But I do think we have to be realistic. The hatred for Israel is intense, it's fairly widespread, and it's very widespread in influential circles.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important for our viewers to hear this because so most of JTV viewers will be, deeply clued in, and so they can get frustrated when people out there who are just kind of
Yes.
bystanders are watching from afar who can't see things the way they do, and they're not, we won't label them as anti-Semites or in any way prejudice. It's just that, as you say, and this is why it becomes so important, the way the BBC acts and other people who are influential act, because they're, if you're fed that every single day, you're going to think, well, these are people in authority and they're telling me this over and over, so maybe it is incomparably terrible what Israel is doing. Can you explain for people who saw that the BBC were criticised about over this Glastonbury coverage that some people will think, but I don't understand what BBC they're just live streaming something. How can they be responsible for this?
It's so interesting because nothing is live. There is no such thing as live TV. Everything is on a delay. The question is, how long is that delay? Sometimes it can be as short as 7 seconds. Sometimes it can be a few minutes. Sometimes it can be 5 minutes. There's always a delay. Anyone who's ever done live TV will know that because you just know that it doesn't go out at the exact time that you're saying it. There's always some kind of delay. Um, so there will have been a delay on this. There will have been an opportunity for one of the 900 people that the BBC sent to Glastonbury. Can you believe what they're doing with our license money? They sent 900 people to this music festival. One of them, some operator, some camera guy, some director, the very large group of people who will have been overseeing that broadcast, they could have pressed a button. They could have gone to another stage. They could have gone to one of their hosts and said, coming up tonight. As soon as they heard death to the IDF, they could have taken action. And if anyone wants to tell me that they wouldn't have taken action if someone on stage had said death to immigrants, of course they would. Or if
Yeah.
someone on stage had said, you know, trans women are men, I bet you any money they would have taken action. They'd have pressed a button. It would have gone somewhere else. There's an element where I think they were blasé about this, either because maybe someone at the BBC shares those kinds of sentiments, or certainly is in the grip of Israelophobia. That's not hard to imagine. Or they just thought it's political, it's a music festival, it's no big deal. But a decision was made at some level. Maybe it was made under intense circumstances. Maybe they were stressed out, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just were confused. But a decision was made, let's leave it. And what that means is that a chant for the death of Jewish soldiers, and by extension of the Jewish nation, was broadcast by the public broadcaster into millions of homes. That's an incredibly serious matter. It's one of the most serious things that the BBC has done ever in terms
Mm.
of its mistakes. So questions need to be answered, and I would say heads need to roll, because a decision was made at some level to broadcast a chant for death from Glastonbury into people's homes, and that's a really bad thing.
Also, they could have done due diligence on this performer.
Yeah, yeah,
There's lots of evidence that he was vitriolic and hateful before this.
exactly. So they didn't show Kneecap live because Kneecap are a bunch of idiots who love to say stupid things as well. Um, like Up Hamas and Up Hezbollah. Let's not forget these are bands which have openly cheered for anti-Semitic movements. And as I've said before, I may have said it to you, but I've certainly said it before. To my mind, that's as bad as if a band went up on stage and said "Up the KKK" or "Up the Nazi Party." So these are bands, Kneecap, Bob Vylan, others. These are bands that say very bad things, which
Mm.
don't just do the punkish thing of saying, F the royal family or F this or F that. We all know what punk music is. We're not being prudes. I am, as you will know, I am a free speech absolutist. I believe in cultural freedom. I think people should say whatever they want, make whatever music they want, get on with it. But we are talking about something a little different today. We are talking about bands which have openly praised anti-Semitic movements, openly, Kneecap, for example, on the 8th of October, 2023, Kneecap posted a picture of themselves smiling ear to ear and said solidarity with the Palestinian resistance. They posted that while there were still Hamas militants in Israel murdering people. So this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about Johnny Rotten, who, by the way, has become a font of common sense over the past few years. We're not talking about the Sex Pistols. We're not talking about, any of that kind of edgy stuff from the past. We're talking about bands which are on record as having given either support or implicated support for movements that murder Jews.
Yeah.
So the BBC knew that about Kneecap. It should have known that Bob Vylan has said things like death to the IDF before. It should have done due diligence. It didn't. And then at that moment, it should have switched it off. So there's failure after failure after failure, which means that the broadcaster, which we are by law compelled to fund, broadcasted that chant for death into people's homes.
And we spoke earlier about how much does this represent British society, but I feel ridiculous even pushing back on this, because why should this even need to be a question that it's condemned? But the Prime Minister, many ministers did condemn it. Lots of news show hosts, newspaper front pages, all condemning that. I will note, with an exception, the Health Minister, Wes Streeting, when asked about it on various media outlets, he kept suddenly turning to this whataboutery about, well, Israel needs to get its own house in order over settler violence incidents, which was just literally blaming Jews for anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So my question is there any kind of glimmer of hope here, that at least it seemed on this occasion, most but not all people kind of seem to, in key positions, seem to say this is not acceptable?
Yes, I would say so. We don't have to be too pessimistic all the time, even though a lot of bad stuff is going on right now. So, yes, I would say there's a glimmer of hope in the fact that influential voices condemned it, and quite vocally as well. I mean, Keir Starmer's a good example. Leaders of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch and others also condemned it. That's good. I mean, it's the bare minimum that they should
Right.
do,
Right.
when you have a large gathering of pretty privileged, quite well-educated British people in a field chanting for the death of an ally's army. The very
Yeah.
least you can say is, this is messed up. This is really wrong. This is
Yeah.
bad. But,
Yeah.
the reason that my hope fades sometimes is that lots and lots of people, as you will know, influential people, have rushed to defend it.
Yeah.
They've rushed to justify this chant, and they've lied to us and said it was just a chant for dismantling a military machine. That's now been disproven by the emergence of the earlier chant, where he says death to every single soldier. They've said it's just an expression of passionate support for Israel, not for Palestine. Not true. They've said it's nothing to do with death itself. It's not an anti-Semitic chant. It's just a political chant. They're all lies. This is an anti-Semitic chant. That's why you now hear it as people are harassing Jews in a Jewish restaurant, because it's an anti-Semitic chant. So yes, there's a glimmer of hope in the fact that people, including the BBC and Emily Evis, who runs Glastonbury, she put out a pretty forceful statement as well, and she called it anti-Semitism. So it's good that that happened. I'm pleased that that response came. because you can imagine in other circumstances there wouldn't have been such a strong response. But at the same time, this chant is spreading like a virus around the world through the activist class, through the media class. People are defending it, and that's really worrying.
It's just amazing. The Be Kind Brigade screaming death, death to people. It's just unbelievable. I have to say, if I mean, obviously it's a very sad thing to say, but at the back of my mind and many other Jewish Brits' minds is, how long do we have her? Is this a long-term home for Jews, this country? We wonder. I certainly think that if the Prime Minister didn't come out and condemn this, you'd have a lot more people pushing this question to the front of their minds, because, as you say, it is absolutely the bare minimum. And it's extremely threatening given the context of what it means, as you alluded to earlier.
The rapper was talking about soldiers.
No, people call for the death of the Russian army all the time.
Do you believe him 100%?
Yes.
That when he said death to the IDF, he didn't mean individuals? Do you believe that?
Well, he's actually unlike. I mean, this is the irony. Do you know what the irony is?
Well, just answer my question first.
Yes, I do.
Because new footage has emerged.
And death to every single IDF soldier out there as an agent of terror.
In 2023, 240 Palestinians had been killed that year by the Israeli state, including 40 children. What else was Hamas supposed to do on the 7th of October?
He just doesn't care about Jewish lives, does he?
No, he doesn't. And, to see him squirm there when he was shown the older clip of Bob Villan, that was really extraordinary, because this was a man who had been exposed on air with Piers Morgan as a person who had been spending the past few days defending a chant for the death of Jewish people. That's what Owen Jones had spent those few days between Glastonbury and that interview with Piers Morgan. That's what he'd spent those days doing, defending a chant for the death of Jewish people. Let's just call a spade a spade. When you're chanting death to the IDF, you are dreaming openly of Jewish death. That's an expression of bloodlust for the death of Jews. And he defended that. And he said it was about dismantling a military machine. He said it was just an anti-imperialist chant. Don't get your knickers in a twist. Calm down, Jews. Don't worry about it. It's fine. And then he was exposed as either an idiot or a liar. Now, I don't know which is worse, because the truth is that Bob Villan, as that earlier clip made clear, wants individual Jews, individual Jewish soldiers to die. So, it's extraordinary. And the excuse making that we've seen from the left more broadly over the past 20 months, the excuse making for Hamas, the way they will say, well, Israel did stuff before 7th of October, and there's been a conflict for 76 years or 77 years. It didn't start on 7th of October, etc., etc. Yes, this did start on the 7th of October. This current war between Israel and Hamas started on the 7th of October. And their minimization of the 7th of October, their treatment of it as just another event in an ongoing conflict, is a form of denialism. It's Holocaust denialism 2.0, because they're saying there was nothing special about that event. There was nothing unique about it. There was nothing different.
Like Dawn
about
French. Dawn French even said that, didn't she? Yeah.
A bad thing, and a bad thing happened to you. Calm down. It's not the end of the world. This constant minimization of Jewish suffering echoes directly the Holocaust denialism that really emerged in the 60s and the 70s, where people were saying, either the Holocaust didn't happen or it wasn't as bad as you people are making out. We saw that constantly after 7th of October. We saw people saying that women weren't raped. There's a new report coming out this week to show yet again that they were raped. They said that not that many people were killed, and if they were killed by the IDF. Israel let it happen because it wanted an excuse to go into Gaza. We've seen lie after lie, denialism after denialism, all directed towards minimizing what happened on the 7th of October. And it's the exact same argument that Holocaust denialists use, which is that Jews lie about the extent of their suffering in order to preserve the power that they truly enjoy. That is the argument behind that's the racist argument behind Holocaust denialism, and it's the racist argument between 7th of October denialism. So this chipping away at the uniqueness of 7th of October, the fact that it represented such a violent tear in our civilization, the fact that it was a rehabilitation of the fascistic mindset itself, the chipping away at all of those truths is really a way of denying, Holocaust denying all over again in a new form, and it's really repulsive.
Absolutely. And the way they do it, exactly as you said, as they say, this didn't start on October 7th. And it's basically one of many inversions they do is they invert cause and effect. So they say the cause is Israel does terrible things. The effect is the Palestinians understandably resist. Whereas actually, if anyone just studies the history with a bit of objectivity, they'll see that the original cause is Arab Islamic anti-Semitism, and the response is Israel having to defend itself since Israel's very inception and before that. And so they do it very well. But it brings me to my next question, which is, Piers Morgan was just being interviewed by Andrew Neil recently on a Times radio, and they were having a debate or discussion about him platforming guests. Even, let's say, I would even put Owen Jones now in one of these categories of extremists because of what he's saying. But people like Candace Owens and Dan Bilzerian, notorious anti-Semites. And I have to say, I feel pretty aligned with what you're saying about free speech absolutism, or almost, unless there's like direct incitement for violence, because I feel more leaning towards, if you suppress, it makes people more suspicious. What do they have to hear? And then it's kind of these things that go underground. Whereas Piers was saying, and challenging Andrew Neil, who was saying, how can you platform these people? Piers was saying, well, they've already got big followings, so I'll platform them, and then I'll challenge them and make them squirm and present arguments to them. Then that can really expose them. My problem with Piers Morgan, though, is that I'm not against that necessarily, the principle of bringing to light what they're saying, but I don't think he does challenge them.
I think that's right. Yes. My view is Piers Morgan can have any guest he wants, and nothing that you or I say is going to change Piers Morgan's mind. He's a pretty stubborn guy. He'll get anyone he wants, and I have a feeling he does it slightly for clicks. He knows that when he has Candace Owens on and he makes a 1-minute clip of her saying something stupid, he knows that will get lots of eyes on his channel. Whatever. Good luck to him. But the thing is, I think you're right. I think I'm all in favor of the sunlight of disinfectant, which is where you challenge hateful views, not by hiding them underground, where often they can fester and grow and get worse. But you shine the sunlight of disinfectant. You show how poisonous they are. You expose them to the world so that people can laugh at them and ridicule them. I'm all in favor of that. But Piers Morgan doesn't always do that. He often just lets these people rant, and he doesn't particularly challenge them. He sometimes says things to them, look, I agree with you that Israel's gone too far, but so he kind of offers that little morsel of legitimacy to what they're saying, when in fact people like Candace Owens are now just anti-Jewish. It's so clear she's an anti-Jewish conspiracy theorist. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I believe in media freedom and freedom of speech, and I certainly wouldn't want any external restrictions on who Piers Morgan can have on his show. But I do think that journalists, especially like Piers Morgan, who's getting a growing audience, they do have a responsibility, I think, to hold guests to account in a meaningful way, especially if those are guests who are on record as saying some really repulsive racist things about Jews.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to turn to what we just saw a few weeks ago, the Israel-Iran conflict, but just touching on a few of the reactions that we saw. First of all, Britain was very neutral, so much so that Israel actually didn't even give prior warning, whereas they did to the Americans. I'm talking about in the initial attack on Iran. But also Britain's response was very, very neutered. I wonder what you made of all of that.
I thought it was shameful, utterly shameful, the way Britain behaved. British officials. Firstly, the fact that we weren't informed initially is indicative of how untrustworthy an ally we've become to Israel, which in itself is pretty shameful. But then the fact that leading Labour ministers just wouldn't come out and say that they supported what Israel was doing. They were just constantly hedging their bets. We need to calm things down and we need to show restraint and everyone needs to stop doing what they're doing. what a bunch of tossers, if you'll excuse my language. Just such cowards, actually, moral, political cowards. Because they were trying to walk that fine line between not pissing off Donald Trump by saying we're against it, but also not losing certain voters, especially Muslim voters and other constituencies upon whom they are increasingly reliant, not losing those by saying that, we're all for it, go Israel. Just cowards.
Yeah.
Really shameful the way they behaved. And I think they should have said, we fully support this. We
Yeah.
fully support what Israel is doing because Iran started this conflict. I mean, it's a conflict that's been going on for some time. But Iran started this current outburst of the conflict when its proxies attacked Israel on the 7th of October. And when its proxies of Hezbollah bombed Israel almost every day in the months after 7th of October, killing 12 Druze children, other Israelis, forcing 60,000 people to leave their homes in northern Israel, one of the largest exiled movements of Jews in a long time. Iran started this, and Iran, of course, fired its own missiles into Israel twice last year. So Iran started this. Israel had every right to fight back. It did so in a surgical, extraordinary way, really rewriting the war rule book all over again. It was just extraordinary what Israel achieved in such a short period of time. And Britain should have said, well done, Israel. We support your efforts against the Islamic Republic that has been tyrannizing you for so long. They couldn't bring themselves to say that. I thought it was disgraceful.
And by the way, it makes Britain's security standing, it jeopardizes that, because if our adversaries see that we don't have that kind of backbone, it projects weakness. What do you make of the reaction among the American chattering classes, particularly on the conservative side, because there's a whole split that took place among the Tucker Carlsons and others versus the people who are like, no, we still should play some kind of role in the world, especially when our security is also under threat, or our allies are. You wrote an article about how this isn't like Iraq. What was your take on this whole debate?
I just think those, the Tucker Carlsons of the world and the people who go on and on about forever wars, they've just embarrassed themselves in front of the world. Tucker Carlson said that if Israel and America drop bombs on Iran, millions will die. Well, that's not happened. And in fact, things have calmed down pretty quickly. The only thing that's died is Tucker Carlson's reputation, which lies in tatters after this, and lots of the others as well. Lots of those other kind of America first, they call themselves. They say we're the true America first, whereas Donald Trump is Israel first, which, by the way, is just another little anti-Semitic jibe, the idea that Israel controls America. They all said that. They all said that this war would be disastrous. It would be Iraq 2.0. It was all built on misinformation. I was against the Iraq war, and I was against the intervention in Afghanistan as well in 2001. Not because I didn't think America had the right to go after the people who carried out 9/11. Absolutely it did. You can't let a gang of terrorists come into your country and kill 3,000 people. My issue with the Afghan war is that it was, so many Afghan peasants died, and they had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. 9/11 was carried out by Saudi rich boys who were funded by Saudis. It was organized primarily by one of the Al-Qaeda chiefs in Pakistan. And the cell was in Hamburg, Germany. You might as well bomb Hamburg, Germany, as well as Afghanistan. So I was against those wars for all those reasons. And, we can have that discussion at some point. But the Iran-Israel war was very different because Iran did attack Israel. Iran does pose a regional threat, a very real regional threat. It is an imperial power that sends its proxies to try to kill Israelis, to try and subdue Israel. It's been fighting proxy wars with Saudi Arabia for the past 10, 15 years in Yemen and elsewhere. This is a dangerous, out of control, theocratic, cruel regime that poses a direct threat to regional stability and arguably to the interests of the West itself. So it's completely different to what we saw during those so-called forever wars of the early 2000s. There is, I just think this kind of what these people refer to as a realist foreign policy is actually just institutionalized cowardice. These people are moral cowards, dressed up as pacifists. We don't want war. No, they just don't want to fight for anything. They don't believe in anything sufficiently to put their lives on the line. I saw a lot of people sharing that meme showing some bloke with an Uzi and a beer can, and the strap line was, "I won't die for Israel."
Yeah.
Well, number one, no one's asking you pasty, doom-scrolling losers in America to die for Israel. Israel doesn't need these people. Israel's got plenty of fit young men and women who are willing to fight for the survival of their country and their people. So no one's asking those losers. They couldn't fight a dead sheep, never mind the Islamic Republic. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, what they're really saying is, we won't fight for anything. These people wouldn't have fought for the Allies in the 1940s. They wouldn't have fought on the side of the North versus the South in the Great Civil War over slavery. They wouldn't have fought for anything. That's what they're really saying. They're making a virtue out of their own cowardice. They're making a virtue out of their own kind of vain desire to live at home and never raise a finger to help another human being. So that's what I think a lot of this so-called America First thing is really about. I understand Donald Trump's instinct to really elevate the interests of America and to stop selling off American business or working class jobs and everything else to countries overseas. I get that. But when you have these extreme American firsters saying we should never go anywhere else or do anything in another part of the world, that's just cowardice masquerading as principle.
Absolutely. They've gone from one, you don't need to go from one extreme to the other of saying, regime change everywhere to nowhere ever doing anything when we're the biggest, economic and military superpower in the world. There is something moral about stepping in when you can to do something that could dramatically change regional conflicts for the better. Want to touch on some bonus questions now, where we just zoom out a bit to see kind of what's coming down the tracks. In the next bonus section of our interview with Brendan O'Neill, I'm going to be talking to him about Zoran Mamdani, the likely mayoral candidate who is deeply hostile to Israel in New York City. We're going to talk about whether he thinks Israel's going to become more isolated among Western nations over the coming years or not. I'm asking him about criticism of Israel and when it's legitimate and when it isn't, and how we can best call that out. Also going to talk to Brendan about the word Zionism. Has it been sullied to the point of no return, or can it be reclaimed? And other topics. So if you want to check out the bonus section, click on the JTV Plus link in the video description, and we'll see you there. I'm so excited to share with you something that I've been working on for a while. We've just taken JTV content to the next level. Introducing JTV Plus, a new platform streaming exclusive content created and handpicked by me. Get ready for jaw-dropping documentaries, exclusive interviews, insider access, and so much more. JTV Plus brings you captivating stories that will shock and inspire you. Stories that, honestly, I'm discovering for the first time too. From Israel to Jewish history to Judaism, it's all there. In exclusive interviews, you'll hear guests open up about things they've never shared publicly before. Plus, I'll take you behind the scenes where I get a lot more personal with you. By joining JTV Plus, you're not just joining an exclusive community, you're partnering with me to help JTV reach new heights. Just search j-tv.plus and join our exclusive community today. There's a link in the video description. I'll see you there.